In this tutorial, we're going to be creating this Vellum setup that we can use for any kind of saliva or drool effects or any type of slime and gooey liquidy type of stuff. I'm also going to show you how I set up the render passes and all of the AOVs and lights and materials. And then we're also going to head over to Nuke to show you how I comped everything together. So let's get started with Houdini and let's step inside the project. And if you want, you can download the project files. Just check the link in the description. And we're going to be recreating the saliva effect from scratch, but I just want to show you a quick overview over how this effect is laid out. So this is achieved basically in two steps. First, we need a way to generate this mesh that's connecting the both sides of the jaw essentially. And if I look at the result of this geometry, it looks something like this. So this is the first thing that we need to create, this geometry that acts as a base. And then from this geometry, we can create grains. So over here we have the Vellum setup, we create the grains, and then we assign the constraints, and then we just plug everything into a Vellum solver, and after we cache this out, we end up with something like this. So let's play this real quick just so we can see this. So from the Vellum solver, I'm just exporting the constraints. So we can see over here that I'm actually exporting the second node, which is the constraint geometry, not necessarily the grain, which would be the first output. And after we have our constraint geometry, we will do a few operations to increase the quality, and then we turn this into a VDB, and then from here we do a few operations and convert it back to geometry, and then a couple of more operations to get our final result, which looks something like this. So I'll go ahead and go up and I'll just create a new geometry container, and we can go ahead and recreate this entire setup from scratch. First, let's import our Alembic animation, and I've also included this in the downloads file if you want to try this yourself. So here we have our skull animation, and whenever we are working with Alembics, we have to set a few options here. So for this load as option, we have to choose unpack Alembic delayed load primitives. So we are not working with packed geometry because we will have to have access to all of the primitives and points, and we can also drop a convert, and we can see essentially with this convert that we go from 1 primitive to 75k, and now we have access to everything we need. So we can append a null here and we will name this geo. So this is just the standard stuff that we do when we are working with Alembic. Load as unpacked Alembic delayed load primitives, and then just append a convert node with all of the default settings. So let's go ahead, and I want to freeze this geometry at the first frame because this is where we have to generate our initial mesh. I will do a time shift here, control shift click this one over here so we can remove the expression, and now this is frozen at the first frame. And from here we need a way to somehow connect the opposite sides of our jawline, sort of where the gums would be. So not exactly the teeth themselves, but rather the areas around the teeth. And there might be a few procedural ways in which we can do this. We could use a measure SOP to measure the concavity of our mesh, and maybe we would be able to select some of these parts, but really the easiest and the fastest way would be to just select the areas that we need ourselves. So if I press spacebar and 4, we can go into a side view. I will hit S on my keyboard and I have the lasso tool selected, and also we have to make sure that the select visible geometry only option is turned off so we can select what's behind the geometry as well. And now I will simply draw the area which I want to select. So we will do something like this, and I will zoom in here a little bit, and now let's also press Shift W to view the wireframe, and now I can hold down Control to deselect polygons on this mesh so we can keep only the regions that we are interested. And again, this will be the areas right around the base of our teeth. So we also want to deselect all of our teeth. Go ahead and deselect this, and I will pause the video while I fine-tune the selection. So after we have our selection, I can go ahead and just press delete. So this will drop a blast node, and we can select delete non-selected, and we are only left with the geometry that we selected. And what I want to do from here is scatter points all over this surface, and then we can use these points to draw lines between them. So let's drop a scatter here, and I will use the density attribute option because we will create this density attribute in a second. Let's disable force total count, and let's also disable relax iteration, and we can see that this gives us an error because we don't have this density attribute. So we can create this attribute with an attribute adjust float, and the reason that I'm using this attribute adjust flow node is because there is this very handy option as a preset here. So if I go to pattern type, we can choose line, and I will press enter in my viewport, and let's also turn on the visualizer for our attribute, and let's also rename to density. So let's turn on the visualizer, and now we can see it here. And again, I will hold spacebar and press 4 to go in the side view, and with this line option I can simply hold down click and drag this over to the other side, and this will give me an attribute that goes from 1 to 0. And we want the opposite thing to happen here, so let's adjust this ramp so it's 1 over here and then 0 towards the front. And we don't really need this to be completely a value of 0, so we can just lower this value. And we can adjust this ramp however we want. And now, since we have this density attribute, we can go to our scatter. Let's disable the visualizer and let's increase the density scale. So now all we did over here with this attribute adjust float, we want to scatter more points in the back of the jaw rather than in front, because essentially I want more saliva to be right at the very end and not so much in front. And this is more of an artistic choice. I found that having too many strings on the front teeth created a kind of an unnatural look, so I decided to just have more saliva or strings in the back. And now that we also have our scatter, we can go back to our attribute adjust float, and we can further control this and refine our points. So maybe we want even less points in the front, but it would be better to create the rest of our setup, and then we can come back later and adjust all of these settings. And now we need a way to draw a line between these two sets of points. And first we need to split these points into separate geometry. So we want a different geometry stream for the upper jaw and a different one for the lower jaw. And we could go ahead and simply grab our selection tool and just grab the points by selection, but since we might modify this scatter later, it would mess up this selection. So we need a procedural way this time to split these points up. And what we can do is we can create a class attribute for our geometry. So over here where we have our initial geometry, if I press S and double click this mesh, we can see that this is a separate object from our geometry, which essentially means that if I drop down a connectivity SOP after our geo over here, so this will create a class attribute that will have a different value based on connectivity. So essentially our upper jaw, or rather our head, will have a certain class value and our lower jaw will have a different value. And this attribute needs to be assigned for the primitives. And now if I go back to the scatter, since the class is a primitive attribute, we have to go in the output attributes tab, and we have to specify that we want to transfer over this class attribute from the primitive level. So we have to select this over here. And now if we check, our points should have this class attribute. And now we can use this class attribute to split the geometries up. So let's drop down a split. Let's hook this here. And for the expression, let's set the group type to points. And we will say that if your class is equal to 1, so equals 1, we are going to split this off. So over here on the left, we will have our head. And over to the right, we will have our lower jaw. So we have successfully split our geometry up. And to draw a line between these two sets of geometries, let's place the first one inside an attribute VOP, and I will place the second one as the second input in this attribute VOP, and I will rename this to create lines. And let's step inside. Now this setup might be a little weird, but the way a line geometry is created, or primitives in general, is if I drop down an add primitive, and we can leave these settings as they are, so the geometry handle will be 0 since we are operating on our own geometry, and for the type we can leave this as open polygon. Now this primnum here is looking for vertices to connect, and over here we will drop an add vertex. And for the first vertex, this will be pretty simple. We are essentially going to connect this vertex to our own points. So from the ptnum here, we will just point this to our own point number. But now it gets a little bit tricky because we have to create a vertex that's on our second geometry. And any given vertex needs to be attached to a point. So first we will need to create a point. So we'll do an add point. And then this point that we create here will be used to attach our second vertex. So over here I will do another add vertex, and we actually want the point number to be inside the point number, and we're going to point the primnum to our primnum, and the handle will be 0. So again, our cells, and here as well we actually have to set up the primnum inside the primnum as well. Now we can see that this kind of does something, and essentially this add point by default is going to create a point that's right at the origin of our scene. So if I turn on the grid, we can see that they're all connecting to the 0, 0, 0 coordinate, and it's creating a point for each point that we already have on our geometry. So if we are operating on 1000 points, when we do this add point operation, it's going to create another set of 1000 points. So we can see that if I were to disable this, we go back to 1.5k points, and when I enable this, we have double the amounts, so roughly 3000 points. And now instead of using this world origin position, so this default of 0, 0, 0, we can use the position of the points from our second geometry. So if I go up, it's going to be these points over here. And what we will do is we are going to open a point cloud on this geometry and look from our own position for the points that are nearest in this second geometry. So let's go back inside here. Let's do a PC open from our second input. So let's drop this PC open. Again, we will look from our own position, and we will increase the search radius just so we know that it's big enough for any given point to find the point from the second geometry. And now to retrieve the position data, we will drop the handle inside a PC filter, and by default we are going to look for the position channel. And now we are going to plug this position inside our PT value for our add point, and here we have the result. Just to reiterate one more time, we are finding the closest position from each point to the points of our second geometry. We are using that position to create a point at that given position. Then we are attaching a vertex on that point. We are attaching another vertex on our current position. And then we are connecting these vertices with this add prim function. And just to give you another example, we can also use a near point function to find the nearest point from the second stream, so from the second input, and use that point number to grab the position, and it would be kind of the same result. So instead of using the PC open and PC filter, if we do a near point, and let's grab this from our own position, this returns a point number which we can use inside an import point attribute. Let's point the file to our second input, and we want to retrieve the position. So if I were to plug this in the PT value over here, we kind of get the same result, but this is the problem with using the near point. It's going to grab the first nearest point from our own position, and a lot of the points from our first input will have the same nearest point. So this is why they are all converging into what looks like individual or rather very specific points. Whereas this PC filter gives us an average of all of the nearest points. So when I plug this here, it's more spread out, and if I were to go to the PC open and increase the number of points, we would get an even more spread out effect. And I can do the reverse of this. So if I were to decrease this, we have the same result as our nearest point. So it's only averaging 1 point, and this means essentially that it's retrieving that point's exact position. But when I start to increase the number of points here, we get a more spread out effect. So this is what we want. I'll get rid of this, and we can go up, and let's continue with our operations. We can also maybe go back to our attribute adjust float here, and now that we also see our lines, we can further tweak this ramp maybe. And we can also maybe introduce some randomness to this. So if I make some room over here, we can do another attribute adjust float. Let's set this also to density, and we'll set the pattern type here to noise. And let's preview our scatter instead. Let's go over here, and we can decrease this minimum value. We can push this in the negative direction. So if I drop this to maybe negative 0.4 or something like this, we can go to the noise pattern here, and let's also decrease the element size slightly. So if I turn this on and off, we have this noise. And if I go back to my lines, let's see what this effect will have. So we actually want to combine this with our previous values. So let's set the operation to multiply instead. And now we also have some noise in our scatter if we need this, but I'll just keep this with our first attribute adjust float. And from here I want to turn these into geometry. And if I display the points here, we can see that we don't really have a lot of resolution on our lines. We just have our initial points, and we have to drop this into a resample. And if I check this, let's decrease the length here to increase our subdivisions. So let's set this to 0.01 maybe, and now we can drop this inside a sweep so we can create some actual geometry from this. Let's set the surface shape to round tube, and let's reduce the radius quite a bit. Let's keep this at something like this. We also want to apply scale along curve, and we can drop the size that's right in the middle. So let's adjust this ramp just so it's thinner towards the middle and it has sort of a bigger base. Let's maybe just increase the radius slightly, so 0.008. Okay, this should be fine. We also have to give these caps, and I will set this option to single polygon. So now these are all filled meshes, which means that we can turn them into a VDB. So let's drop this into a VDB from polygons. Let's reduce the voxel size quite a bit here. Let's try 0.01, 0.001, and I think something like this is fine. Maybe this is too much. Let's try 0.004. Okay, this is looking fine. Maybe 0.003 should be good. And now we have access to all of our SDF operations, so we can use VDB smooth SDF rather. Let's reduce the iterations here, maybe only use one iteration. I think this will be fine. And I can also do a VDB convert and see how this will look as polygons. So if I set this to polygons, this is the mesh that we end up with. So I think this is looking pretty decent. Maybe I would want to reduce the scatter amount. So let's use less points. Let's decrease this and go back to our sweep, and I will just increase this radius to 0.15 just so they're a little bit thicker. It might be also useful to preview this with our mesh, so I will select the mesh and press W. Let's go back to our convert here, and something like this will be fine. Maybe I can add another iteration for our VDBs. Maybe let's do a couple so we can really mush these strings up together nicely. Now all of these values that I used here took a little bit of time to set up, and I even changed a lot of these settings after I simulated. So that's just the nature of this workflow and Houdini in general. You don't really know exactly the values that you need until you have all of the elements in place. With that being said, I think this is good enough for our base. So let's drop a null from here, and this will be our slime geo. Let's copy this so we can create another chain for our simulation over here. So we will do an object merge and just bring this over here. So our slime. So let's turn this geometry into grains. Let's do a configure grains, Vellum configure grains, and we will use create points from volume, and we need to lower the particle size here quite a bit. So let's maybe use 0.005. Okay, so this is looking pretty good. We are working with 160,000 points, which should be fairly decent. Obviously, the lower you go with this particle size and the more points you have, the more detail you will get in your simulation. So this will depend on the type of shot that you're working on, if it's a close-up, if it's a medium shot. So it's going to be up to you to decide the resolution that you need over here. Maybe I will just increase this slightly more. So let's use 0.004. And this should be good. So for our first type of constraints, we will need a glue constraint. So let's drop down a Vellum constraints. And here's a cool little trick. If you hold down J and you click and drag from one node to the other, it's going to automatically connect all of the inputs in their respective order. So that's a really cool trick that I didn't know of until recently. Let's go to our Vellum constraints and let's choose for constraint type. Like we said, let's use glue. And I want to preview these constraints. So from our second input, I will drop down a null so we can only preview the constraints. And currently we are not seeing any constraints. Let's change the group type to points, and also the target group type will be points as well. And now we have some lines that are being connected by points. We will increase, let's first increase the constraints per point. So we want each point to attach to multiple points surrounding it. So let's increase the constraints here. Maybe let's try I usually like to increase this value until there's no longer a noticeable difference if I add more points to this mix. So if I increase this to 6, we can see that it starts to reach a point where there's minimal difference. So if I increase this to 7, there's very little difference. So let's maybe just keep the constraints per point at 6. And the minimum value, the minimum surge value of 0.1 seems to be working fine. I might want to increase this, and we can see that this makes a little difference. So let's just keep this at 0.1. And this is pretty much it for our glue. We will need to turn on the braking, but we will worry about this in a second. First, we need to attach all of this to our geometry as well. So let's get rid of this null. And from our Vellum constraints, let's go ahead and turn off show guide geometry. And here we will append a Vellum attached to geometry. So let's drop this here and also use the J shortcut to connect these nodes up. And with this Vellum attached to geometry, we will need our third input to be our head geometry, so our geo over here. Let's grab this geo. Let's use an object merge just to bring this over here. So again, this is our original animation. Let's plug this in our Vellum attach. And let's check our settings here. We want the group type to be points. So now essentially all of our points are attached to the nearest positions that they find on our head geometry, and we want to turn on the max distance here because we only want to connect the points which are really close to the mesh. So this will be a pretty sensitive value. So let's start with a value of 0.005, and we can see already that this found some points for us. And I can look at some of these and check if this is accurate enough. I might want to increase the max distance. Let's maybe try 0.01 just to make sure that all of these points that are really close are connected to the geometry. And I think this should be fine. So let's go ahead and plug this inside a Vellum solver. So let's go ahead and add a Vellum solver and attach it to our chain. And from here, I am actually interested only in our constraints. So we'll drop a null from the second output of our Vellum solver so we can preview our constraints. And we only want our glue constraints. So we can also drop down a blast node. Let's choose the type here. We will say, let's get rid of our attach constraints. So we are only left with our glue constraints. Let's just play the simulation as it is and see if stuff seems to work. So let's press play. Okay, and it seems to be working. Now there's a few points that get disconnected here, and this is probably from the attached to geometry constraints. We don't have to worry about them. We can see that most of the slime constraints, so our glue constraints, they stay together. Obviously they're way too stretchy, so we can fix this in a second. But we can already tell that the setup is working. So now it's really only a matter of adjusting the values until we get the correct feel and look. So right away in our Vellum solver, we will need to increase our substeps. And because we are working with an animation that's pretty fast, it would be more beneficial to us to turn on the global substeps. So this will mean that it's going to take into account the steps in our collision geometry as well. And from previous experiments, I know that a value of 5 global substeps here seem to be okay. Also in our forced step, since we are in the Vellum solver, usually I like to add a little bit of velocity damping as well, but we don't really need a super high value here, so let's just use a value of 0.003. And also I want to reduce this wing drag. Let's also use 0.003. So let's reset our simulation and see how things look now. And we can see that we get a more accurate behavior, but since this is a little slow, what I'm actually going to do is let's see if there's a way to reduce these constraints. So maybe 700,000 constraints is a little bit too much, especially since we are trying to do some tests here. We will go back to our grains. Let's increase this to 0.005 And for our glue constraints, let's reduce the constraints per point to a value of 5. And now we are dealing with 300,000 constraints. So this should be a little bit more manageable. Now for our glue constraints, we actually don't want to have such a very high stiffness. Let's use a lower value here. Let's try 1000. And I also want to increase the damping ratio quite a bit. So this will conserve energy in the simulation way better, and it will give us more consistent result, and we shouldn't have as many errors and also weird jittery movements. So let's increase the damping ratio. We will set this to 0.001, or rather 0.01. And again, the stiffness for our glue, let's set this to 1000, and let's check our simulation. So I can already tell that this is stretching way too much. Let's go ahead and increase this to 10,000. Alright, so I think still a little bit too much. We also need to add a wind force that's essentially going to be in the direction of where the skull is supposedly screaming. So it's going to be a vector that's pointing in the positive z direction and in the negative y. And also I'm kind of annoyed a little bit by all of these stray points. We can simply append a clean SOP, and this will get rid of all of the points that are not basically connected with any primitives. So let's go back in our Vellum solver and let's go ahead and add this wind. We will use a pop wind. And I know these settings from the previous example. I want a wind that has a velocity of -4 on the y direction and a value of 8 on the z, and also I will increase the amplitude and decrease the swirl size. So let's go up, and I might want to also increase the wind drag. Let's leave this back to 0.1 and velocity damping 0.05, and let's simulate this now. So I think this is looking pretty decent. Now when I created the original render, I did spend a lot of time adjusting settings and tweaking values, and that's just the nature of working in Houdini. So you really need to spend a lot of time to finesse everything to get it to work exactly like you want. But this is pretty much the setup, and the only thing left to do here is introduce braking as well. And for the braking, we can go to the Vellum glue constraints, and over here we can simply enable braking. We can leave the type as a stretch stress, and the threshold, we will leave this at the default, because what we want to do, and what I did in the original example, is I animated this threshold value for the braking inside the Vellum solver, meaning that the animation started with a pretty high threshold, so the saliva basically doesn't break over here in the beginning, and then over from frame 20 maybe I started to decrease this threshold, and as a result, as the animation progresses, the constraints start to break gradually. So in Houdini we can go inside the Vellum solver. Let's use a Vellum constraint properties, and we want to activate the break threshold here. And this is how you basically have to animate any type of Vellum settings. You can't really animate it over here inside the Vellum constraints at the SOP level. You have to animate it inside the Vellum solver, otherwise this doesn't work. So let's start with a value of 100. Let's go up and let's simulate and see if this instantly breaks essentially. And yeah, I can see that everything breaks instantly, so we have to, let's set this to 1000, and we'll go back and simulate a few frames. So we can see that with 1000 they mostly stay together, but some do break, so probably we need a value higher than 1000. Let's go back inside and let's try to animate this. Let's set this to manual, and we will set the break threshold at 1500. We'll go forward to maybe frame 20, and from here we will add a keyframe with Alt and left click, and we will slowly decrease this threshold over a duration. Let's try maybe at 72. We can use a break threshold of 500, and let's go back and update. Turn on auto update. Let's go up, and now we can actually start to cache the files as well. So we will do a file cache here, and let's save to disk and see what we get. And we can check the result. Alright, and as I progress through the animation, we can see that the constraints start to break off. So probably this is looking alright. Now again, just like the other settings, I went back and forth inside the Vellum solver with the break threshold. I used a lot of combinations between the break threshold, the pop wind settings, the Vellum glue constraints, so the stiffness here, and even the damping ratio. So these are all parameters that you have to play with until you get something that looks right. So let's go ahead and focus on our constraints and see how we can turn this into geometry. If I turn on the point display, we see that we do have a lot of points, so plenty of points to work with. But what we can do is throw a resample on this to further introduce even more points and make sure that we have enough. So let's set the length here to 0.05 maybe. And now we can see that this essentially fills in our curves. And maybe we don't actually need such a low value here. Let's try 0.01. Alright, and we can see that this still adds quite a bit of detail to our lines. And now that we have this extra set of points, we can use a VDB from particles. I'll go ahead and place this over here and not automatically connect it to our resample, because I want to set the values first, just so it doesn't freak out, because the default values for the point radius scale, since we don't have a p-scale, this is going to be a really large result. So I will just decrease this, and let's set the voxel size to 0.001 and also the radius to the same value and the minimum radius as well, and see what we get if I connect this here. Alright, and I think we can safely reduce this further. Let's try 0.003. And again, we will have to modify the radius scale as well. But I think something like this is starting to look alright. And from here we can also do a VDB smooth SDF. So all of our common SDF operations, we can even do an erode and stuff like that. Let's decrease the iterations here, maybe just keep this as 1. We might want, the reason that this is eroding even though we are smoothing is because we don't really have enough resolution on this VDB. So let's go ahead and let's try 0.002 and maybe even less. I don't want to go too high, but I think this should be fine. Let's maybe try 0.02 and let's decrease the length in our resample instead, so we can add more points. Let's try 0.006. Okay, so we can see that this fills up some of these gaps a lot better. Let's also turn this into a geometry, so let's do convert VDB and let's convert to polygons. Alright, and we can see that when I do this, this automatically thins everything out, and I think this is looking pretty good. We are having a lot of detail here. And what I did in the original example as well is I also used a smooth after we turned this into geometry. So we used the smooth on the geometry itself. And we can see that this also blends everything together a little bit better. So if I turn this on and off, probably we are seeing a minimal difference here. Let's set the filter quality to 1. Alright, so this is with the smooth. And also in the original file, I used a peak node to thin this out even further. So if I drop down a thin, or rather a peak, we can set the distance to a really low value, and we can push this in the negative direction. So let's try negative 0.0, let's try 0.002 or something like this. Again, these values are going to be very sensitive, and with this peak node we are thinning everything out even more. But I think in this case, for this result specifically, we don't really need this peak node, but this is definitely something that you can do. So I'll just get rid of this in our case, and with this we now have our saliva. So this is the entire setup. From here I can drop down a null, and this will be our out saliva. And this is basically it. So again, I will have to, let's also preview our mesh as well. And I think this is looking pretty good. It's really nice and detailed. So it's going to depend on you how thin or thick you want the saliva to be, or how many strings you want. But hopefully with the setup that I showed you, you will be able to tweak these parameters to get the exact look that you are going for. As far as rendering is concerned, this is a very simple setup. I only have a few lights over here, and we're gonna go over each light in a second. As far as materials, are concerned, the materials are very basic as well. So if I go in the material tab, for the saliva, this is the material, so it's just a standard material, and this is using Redshift. For the properties here, I set this base color to be almost completely black, so I drop the weight here to around 0.1, and I'm using quite a high value for the reflection and low roughness. I'm increasing the IOR as well, and I'm using a high value for the transmission as well, so we get the refractive look. And this is pretty much all of the settings that I used for the saliva. And if I go to the skull material, this is basically just a bunch of noises combined, so we can see that in the diffuse color, or rather the base color, reflection, roughness, and in the bump, we just have a bunch of Maxon noises combined with, or actually I can see that I'm only using Maxon noises here. So it's a very simple material, and I created this essentially just so there's not really a flat color as the material. But if you are working in a production, you will definitely be working with higher quality assets, which will come with their own textures, so we don't really have to worry about this. And if you would like to check out exactly how I build this material, you can go ahead and download the project files and inspect all of these nodes yourself. So let's go up, and I will go to the object level, and I will grab all of these lights, and I'll go ahead and turn them off, and then we can go one by one and enable them and talk a little bit about the process here. So if I start with this dome light, I will turn this on, and I can preview this in the viewport here as well. I'll turn on enable the viewport so we can see this. This is just a simple sky texture, so this is used mainly as our main fill light. I usually like to start with something like this, and you can either use an indoor HDRI or an outdoor HDRI. In this case, I like using this sky texture because it creates a very diffuse look, and it does a good job just filling up the geometry. So if I go in the Redshift render view, let's hit play and let's see what this light provides. Alright, so this is our dome light, and let's go ahead and grab this fill light and let's turn this on. So this is a simple aerial light that's coming somewhere from below, and if I go back to the scene view, we can see that this is this fill light that I'm talking about, so the light that we are currently on, and as the title suggests, this is used as a fill. So let's go back to the render view and hit play, and let's enable our next light, which is going to be our ring light. So if I turn this on, this is again another aerial light that's coming from above, and it's used to create this nice silhouette over the top of our skull geometry. And this is more or less the main light that I'm interested in here, which again creates this silhouette over our skull, so we can separate the mesh from the background. And on top of all of this, there's another aerial light, so this sharp light over here. If I turn this on, this is sort of the same as our rim light, but we can see that it's a lot more intense, and it also has a sharper contrast on our silhouette. So if I go in the scene view, this long stretched plane here is our sharp light, and this more regular looking plane over here is going to be our rim light. So basically, the larger the area this plane is, so the size of our light, this will determine how sharp the light and shadows will be. So I'm using rather large planes for the rim light and the fill light, and I'm using this very thin layer for our sharp contrast on the top of the head over here. And then finally, let's go back. We can enable our volumetric light, and let's actually go in the scene view, and the volumetric light is this plane over here. It's rather thin as well, so let's turn this on. And I experimented a lot with the size of this, so it started out as more of a rectangle shape, but this was giving me way too much volumetric effect, so I decided that I should just sharpen this instead. So as a result, if I go to the Redshift render view, this is with the volumetric. So we can see that if I were to make this even thinner, so the plane, so for example, if I were to drop this to 0.6, we would have less volumetrics in our shot. And you can also play around with the spread as well if you want this to be sharper or softer. So let's go ahead and undo the settings. And it's important to note that in this volumetric tab, if I go to the contribution tab over here, all of the diffuse, reflection, all of these settings are set to 0, and I only have the volume contribution set to a value of 1. And in all of the other lights, if I go to the contribution, I have the diffuse, reflection, transmission, all of these settings set to 1, and the volume set to 0. So I only want this volumetric light to be used to emit volumes. And in the out tab in our Redshift render op, if you go to Redshift and you go to the advanced tab, in the volumetrics tab, this has to be set to enabled, and this will use your lights as the volumetric source. So when you are using this setting, it's important to set the contributions for each individual light carefully. While we are in this render op, let's go to the output tab, and in the AOV manager we are using quite a bit of AOVs over here. So we have the standard, let's maybe make some room here, we have the standard diffuse, specular light, refractions and reflections, and this will give us our beauty pass. So if I scroll through these AOVs over here, we can see them. And I'm also using the light group tab, so I'm enabling this all light group option for all of these layers. And essentially if I go to my lights, we can see that for all of these lights over here, so aside from our volume light, we have the light group option turned on, and it's using this $OS expression, which just grabs the name of our node. So this way, in our AOVs over here, with this light group option enabled, we can split the contribution from each light individually. So if I go one by one, we can see exactly this is the specular from the dome light, and then the specular from only the rim light, and from the fill, and I actually have the volumetric as well, but this doesn't do anything. But here we can see the specular hits only from the sharp light. So this is very useful to have. And essentially when we add all of these layers up together, we recreate the beauty pass, and then we can go individually and grade everything separately, so we have full control over each light contribution in this shot. So again, there's diffuse, specular, refractions and reflections. Then there's this volume lighting AOV. So if I go to this, let's see this real quick. Let's select this over here. So this is the volume one, which is just the volumetric effects from our volumetric light. Then we have the cryptomat, but I didn't end up using this. This is basically to separate the objects by materials. So we would have an ID for the saliva and an ID for the skull. But like I said, I didn't end up using this. Then I also created a couple of custom shaders over here. So there's the ambient occlusion shader and the Fresnel shader. And to create these custom shaders, you have to go in the shop context. And in this context, we have the AO and the Fresnel, and all you have to do basically is just create a Redshift network. And if you step inside, for example, to create the AO pass, let's drop an RSAO node and we just connect this to the surface. So this is how you can create the shader. And if I go up, we can check that inside the AO there's only the ambient occlusion, and inside this Fres we have the Fresnel shader. So with these shaders, let's go to the out tab. In the default shader path, this is pointing to the shader that we created in the shop context. So if I check to see how these AOVs look, we have the AO, so our ambient occlusion, and then we also have the Fresnel as well. And then finally we also have the world position, and we need to do a bucket rendering to see this, but these are basically all of the passes that we need. So let's go ahead and we can jump over a Nuke and go over the comp. So here is the entire comp, and we can see that this is a very simple and quick comp. There's really not a lot going over here. We basically start by separating all of the AOVs as I mentioned earlier. So there's the diffuse, there's the reflection, specular fill. We can see that I actually separated the specular AOVs per light. So there's specular dome, fill, rim and sharp. So we have individual control over this. And for the refraction, this is mainly only affecting our saliva because the skull doesn't have any transmission. So all of these operations here are plus. I'm just merging them over on top of each other, so we can go one by one. And in between these last one, I also added a sharpen, and then I'm plussing over the refraction from the saliva. So this is essentially recreating the beauty pass without taking into account the volumetric effects. And now for each of these layers I can go one by one and I can adjust any of these channels. So I can grab the specular and I can increase this specular sharp, or if I wanted more fill I can increase this, or maybe the main, let's see, the diffuse, I can also increase this, and we can see that this really offers ultimate control. Now on top of all of our layers that comprise the beauty pass, I also separated the Fresnel from this. I graded this down a little bit so it's sharper, and I grabbed the position pass, which gives me the world position of our object, meaning that if I were to connect all of these over, the red channel would be the position on the X direction, the green channel is the position on the Y direction, and the blue channel is the position in the Z direction. So I wanted to create a gradient that's along the Z direction of this mesh that starts from somewhere around the nose and travels across the face. So I can grab the Z component, which is the blue channel of this P position, and if I plug this inside the alpha and I press A to only visualize the alpha, we can see we kind of get this gradient that's on the Z direction, and I can use a grade node to further adjust the in and out value, so the black point and the white point. And we can see that as I move these around, I'm controlling this gradient. So I can also maybe make this sharper. Just to give you an example, we can see that I'm squeezing this gradient together, and I can also use the offset to create some really cool effects, sort of like a wave traveling over the geometry. So we can do something like this. So I'll go ahead and undo all of this. So we are back with our initial gradient, and I'm using this gradient now to darken my Fresnel pass. So over here where I have the original Fresnel, I'm grading this down and using the position pass as a mask. So we can see the result now is that I'm filtering a region that's only in front of our skull. And I can always go back to this grade node for our position, and I can play around with the settings, and I can control this fading further. And essentially with this, now I'm just adding this over my beauty recreation, so after all of our layers. So let's go ahead and see the result. And maybe this isn't too noticeable, but if I turn this on and off, we can see that I'm adding this highlight over here, which is basically just enforcing the shape of our skull. And I thought this added a nice little detail that's worth having. And also we can see, if I preview the result over here, if I were to disable this masking with our position, so if I were to disable this, we get too much light here, too much information in the back of our skull, whereas I needed it only in the front of our skull. So this is why I use this gradient from the world position. So moving forward, we are copying back the alpha from our original render, doing a pre-mold here to get back our original edges, and on top of this we are adding back our volumetric light. And in order to create this gradient, I created a radial which looks something like this, and I blurred it a little bit just so I can spread it. I graded this up, and then to map different colors along this gradient we can use an ST map. So this radial is used as an ST map in this node. And for our source, I'm using the gradient editor. So this is a custom node that's available for free on Nukepedia, so you can go ahead and grab this as well. And this is the gradient that I'm creating here. So in the ST map, for the UV channels, we are going to set this to RGB, and this is the result that we get. So now I'm multiplying this with our original pass. So from our original render, we are shuffling out the volume pass. I'm also using a noise reduction plugin over here to get rid of some of this noise, but this is not a 100% necessary step. I'm also grading this up a little bit, so I'm increasing the gain and decreasing the gamma so I can increase the contrast. And when we multiply it with the custom gradient that we created here with the ST map, we get this result. And after this, I'm desaturating the colors a little bit, and I'm also grading this up, and I'm doing a crop. And this is essentially now our volumetric pass. So when we add this on top, we get this result. And the cool thing with this setup is I can always go back to this gradient editor. So for example, let's actually create a new gradient editor, and let's point it to this second gradient editor that we created here. and I will just create a new gradient here. So we can see that we really have a lot of options over here. Let's maybe get rid of this as well, and we can do something like this. Let's try a red color instead. So let's make this first point brighter and maybe more saturated, and this point in the middle, let's try maybe something like an orange and saturate this up a little bit. Do something like this, and let's use a dark red as our final color here. So we'll do something like this. So probably not the best palette, but this is just to illustrate how flexible this setup is. So let's point this back to our original gradient colors. So moving forward, I'm dropping all of this inside the motion blur, just so we can add a little bit of smearing here when the saliva starts to detach and it's moving a little bit faster. And then I'm using my favorite exponential glow node, which is AP Glow. So if I look at this result, this is a very subtle effect, and we can see that it has quite a high spread, and this layer I'm just plussing over what we had already, so it's giving us this very nice and soft glow, and this is also helping our layers blend a little bit better together, and I think overall it's giving the shot more of an artistic and stylistic look. After this we are doing a final grade node, and I don't think actually this doesn't do anything, so I can get rid of this. And I also have an OCIO file transform over here, which I'm using to apply a custom LUT to the entire render. And this LUT that I'm using here is one of the default ones that comes with Redshift. So if I go back in the Redshift render view and I hit play over here, let's go to the settings, and if I turn on LUT, I'm basically using one of these LUT files over here that's available to us. So I think I'm using one of the, let me check. So I think I'm using one of these Canon LUTs. And again, this is just to make it a little bit more artistic overall. And this will be the end of our comp, and also the end of this tutorial. So the project files are available to download with the skull animation included, so go ahead and download that by checking the link in the description. I hope you enjoyed it and that you learned some new things, and hopefully we will see each other again in a new tutorial.